I'm not going too far into the book of Galatians today because some of us are missing. But I did want to give an introduction to Galatians. And I think the book of Galatians gives us a pretty good idea of why God especially called Apostle Paul. Because the other apostles were living in Galilee or Judea, and they couldn't think outside, as we say, they couldn't think too far outside the box. And even though Christ had taught them something about better understanding of the law, we ourselves don't have a very good understanding of what it means when we talk about the Old Testament law, because we don't read it. We think about the Ten Commandments, but we think those are the Ten Commandments are the ones that were in the ark. That's not true, they weren't. They weren't the ones that God gave on Mount Sinai. They were ones that Moses gave before he went up to Mount Sinai. But so we think of the Ten Commandments. And we needed somebody to open the gospel up. You needed somebody who had 1 foot in Judaism and 1 foot in the Greek world. So you needed a bridge somehow. Because what the problem Apostle Paul had with the Galatians, some Jewish Christians came to Galatia and they were telling everybody, oh, you have to be circumcised, you have to follow the Jewish dietary laws, you have to, you know, all these things, you can't cut your hair, you can't shave your beard, nothing, because you have to be a proper Jew to be a Christian. And Paul's saying, oh, who's bewitching you? Why are you falling for all this? I'm telling you, you have the freedom of the gospel. And later he's going to tell us we don't stop to think sometimes. The Old Testament doesn't mean anything to us. It's history and it has prophecies about Jesus Christ. The reason it's important to us is because of the prophecies about Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. And because the prophets, holy prophets, were leading us toward the time of Christ. You know, in the time of Manasseh, they were killing all the prophets because they didn't want to hear them. The prophet Amos even went to the Gentiles, the people outside Jerusalem, and told them, how do you betray God? You think you betray God by disobeying this law or that law or the other law? No, no, no. You betray God when you abandon the widow and the orphan. You betray God when you don't care for the poor. You betray God when you don't love the stranger. That's how you betray God. So everybody's thinking about this law and that law, and they're not thinking about their actions. They're not thinking about how they relate to other human beings. And, you know, if you want to look at the Old Testament law, you have to kill your neighbor if he mows the lawn on Sunday. Well, actually Saturday, because Saturday is the Sabbath. So if you catch your neighbor mowing the lawn on Saturday, you should kill him if you want to obey the Old Testament law. I told you once before, if you obeyed the Old Testament law, you would be in prison. If you were in Texas, you'd have a death penalty probably. But so we have to stop and think, what did Christ say, first of all, about the law? When his apostles were gathering some grain on Sabbath day, in order to feed themselves. And when Christ would heal somebody on the Sabbath day, all the Pharisees, you know, these very strict religious people, would condemn him. They would criticize, even though he healed somebody who was blind on the Sabbath, they would criticize him. And then Christ said, the Sabbath was given for man. Man wasn't given for the Sabbath. Why the Sabbath was given to us, so we had a day of rest. Even the cattle, even the oxen, the horses, they got to rest on the Sabbath. They got 1 day of peace and they didn't have to go to work. The slaves also got rest on that day. If we didn't have the Sabbath, nobody would get a day off. They'd have to work 24/7, 7 days a week. So God gave us 1 day so we could rest. So for the sake of our bodies and our minds, we had to rest. So they misunderstood. But Apostle Paul is here to say, look, we call it New Testament, Old Testament. It means that there is an old agreement with God, an old covenant with God. Now there's a new covenant. If there's a new covenant, there's a new law, a different law. The old law isn't there anymore. You have a new law. It's the law of Jesus Christ. And what did Jesus Christ tell us? If you listen to Jesus Christ and you love God with all of your being, and you love your neighbor as yourself, and he said, don't do to other people what you don't want them to do to you. But that encompasses the whole 10 Commandments, because no murderer wants somebody to murder them. No thief wants somebody to steal from them. So if you don't do to other people what you don't want them to do to you, you obey the 10 Commandments. See? The last and longest of the 10 Commandments was not to be jealous and envious and not to desire what your neighbor has. You should be glad for your neighbor if he has good things. You shouldn't be jealous or envious. See, that's part of our worldly culture. You know, there's an English expression that we have to keep up with the Joneses. If Mr. Jones next door buys a new car, we have to buy a better car because we want to feel better than him. Okay, that's the 10th commandment is telling us don't do that. You know, if he goes out and buys 3 oxen, don't you go out and buy 4. Just be happy for him that he can afford to have 3. So we should be happy for our neighbor, not desire what he has. That's what happens that's what gets us into trouble, what leads us into do bad things, when we are envious or jealous of other people. You know, we do the best we can, we're satisfied with what we have. But Apostle Paul here is telling you, you have a new covenant. You don't have to seal the covenant with circumcision. You have to seal the new covenant with the condition of your heart. That's what he said, to be circumcised in your heart. So it's the condition of your heart that makes this new relationship with God. And today's gospel, you know, it's a seamless gospel, 3 parables. The first one tells us that the foolish virgin didn't have the oil of humanity. They didn't care about the rest, they cared only about themselves. They didn't care about the rest of humanity. In the second parable, God gives divine grace to each person, and you're supposed to use that grace. And if you want to understand it better, look at the River Jordan. It flows into the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee is a lot of fish. It's fresh water, it's good water. It has enough fish to feed people. For thousands of years, people have found enough food in the Sea of Galilee. And the river flows down to the Dead Sea, and nothing grows there. You can't catch any fish in the Dead Sea. Why? Because water flows in to the Sea of Galilee and it flows out on the other side, and so the water stays fresh. The water only flows into the Dead Sea, it doesn't flow out again, so the water becomes dead because it's not flowing. So when God gives us grace and gives us abilities, if we store them inside of ourselves and don't let that go out to other people, it dies within us. We become like the Dead Sea. But if we receive divine grace and we receive the Word of God, and we receive the love of God, that love and that grace flows out of us to other people. It's alive. It bears fruit. But if we don't open up and it doesn't flow out of us to other people, we become like the Dead Sea. It's all dead in us. So that's what he means by the parable. You know, a talent was 100 weight of gold, or a cent weight of gold, of silver, I'm sorry. It's, we call it in the Serbian, it's called dinars. But it's weight of gold. And once the last judgment happens, and God comes and he says, well, I gave this person grace, he reached out to other people with love and with grace. So give him more. Make him richer in love and grace. And the second one, the same. He gave him what he knew he could bear. He didn't give him too much. Only what he was strong enough to bear. and he sent it out to other people, all this love and this grace. So he's going to get double in the heavenly kingdom. And the one person received divine grace, and he hid it like burying it in the Dead Sea. He didn't give love to anybody, didn't share grace with anybody, nothing. So you take away from even what he thought he had. That's what the last judgment is. That God's going to give more to those who showed love, who showed compassion, who showed care for other people. But to the person who was selfish, who kept everything in himself, he's going to even take that away from him. So that's the last judgment. You lose what you thought you had because you did nothing with it. So in the book of Galatians, Apostle Paul is reminding people, you're Christians now, you're not Jews. Okay, they're Jewish Christians, that's fine. You keep the Jewish laws because you're Jewish Christians. These people are not Jewish Christians. They're just Christians. They have a new covenant with God. They have a new testament with God. And what God gives them by grace. They don't have to do these works anymore of the law, you know. Now you have grace and you have love. And your duty is to show that love to others and to show that grace to others. Not to follow these laws. So that's the whole message in the book of Galatians. We're under the image of Christ. We're not under the law of Moses. The law of Moses has nothing to do with us. The promise to Abraham has something to do with us. We're children of Abraham. We're not children of Moses. Even Apostle Paul tells us that you become children of Abraham, and therefore children of the promise. So the law doesn't mean anything to us, but what did Jesus Christ teach us? He gave us a new moral law. And what was his moral law? He said, love one another as I loved you. Have love amongst yourselves, and people will know that you're followers of the Christ. Love your neighbor as yourself, and love God with all your being. That's the moral law. But think what it means if you truly love somebody, if you truly love others. What does it mean you can't do because of your love? You know, anybody, any pagan, any idiot can follow a law because they don't want to get in trouble. You know, that's just the law of self-preservation. You don't want to get in trouble, so you follow the law. That has no meaning for your salvation. For your salvation, it's only what's in your heart. Not what's in your head, but what's in your heart. Why you do things. How many times do we catch ourselves not thinking about our own weaknesses, but judging somebody else? What good is that? It's just a waste of energy. You're wasting your own energy when you judge other people. You judge yourself. Every time you look in the mirror, you're looking at a picture of your biggest problem. You know, your real problem stares back at you from the mirror. And we want to, we only judge other people so we can feel better about ourselves and hide our own sins. That's why we judge other people. We want to hide our own sins from ourselves. It's not normal to be judging other people. It's normal to be trying to clean yourself up. And that's what the book of Galatians is going to teach us. Don't pay attention to this law. Pay attention to what Jesus Christ revealed to us, not what Moses taught. The law of Moses doesn't mean anything to us. If you think about the law of Moses, it teaches you to stone your sons to death if they disobey you. It teaches you can sell your daughter into slavery. It tells you how to cook goat meat. That's in the law of Moses. Yeah, don't boil it in its mother's milk. All of these little details. What good is that for your salvation? For your salvation, you have to change the inner person. You have to change your heart. And so this is what Apostle Paul is going to tell us in the book of Galatians. We'll take it up chapter by chapter, but I just want to give the overview of it today so we get a point of it. I hear these preachers, on television and mega churches and things. They're always telling you what's wrong with the whole world, what's wrong with the people around you, what's wrong with society, what's wrong with culture. But what about what's wrong with you? What about your mistakes and your errors? That's a real problem. We're not thinking. We have to put the brain and the heart together. We have head knowledge, we have to have heart knowledge. We have to bring the knowledge from our brain into our heart to transform ourselves in it. Mankind is essentially good. You can look around you and see that people are essentially good. We have evil things that happen, but we have more good things than evil things that happen. When there's a catastrophe anywhere, people respond, they send money, they go there and try to help. They try to, even sometimes you'll see on the street some teenager who looks kind of rough or something, and all of a sudden he does something good in front of you. Because it's normal for people to desire to do good. But evil is like a parasite, it's like a disease that afflicts us. And we have to struggle against it. But remember that mankind is essentially good. Mankind is not essentially evil. Evil is like a parasite of some kind. It's not the normal condition of mankind. And there's more good being done than evil. It's just that the evil can be seen more easily. So don't look at what's going on out there. I mean, people, they preach fear and hate. Because fear and hate make more money for them. In the Protestant churches, they pass this offering plate around. They want you to put money in there. If the sermon makes you afraid of something, you're going to put more money in. So they preach hate just so you'll get more money. But why to preach hate? The Divine Liturgy doesn't teach us to hate. The Divine Liturgy doesn't teach us to fear. The Divine Liturgy teaches us to hope and to look forward to everlasting life, to look forward to paradise. There's nothing in the liturgy that threatens us with punishment. There's nothing in the Divine Liturgy that tells us who we should hate. There's nothing in the Divine Liturgy that makes us fear. Everything in the Divine Liturgy tells us to hope, tells us that we're under the promise, tells us that Jesus Christ is going to give us what he promised us. That we can depend on God. In the end, we can depend on God for the heavenly kingdom, we can depend on God for everlasting life. That's all the liturgy teaches us. So when you preach hate and fear, it's betraying, it's a betrayal of God. And it's a lie, because we're pretending that God is some kind of evil being in the sky who wants to get you. That God has some kind of sukuratati. Some kind of udba, as we say in Serbia. My elder brother, Mina Dobjo, was in Serbia, in Romania. I used to go to confession to him. He was up by Yash, in one little town outside Yash. And one time, one of my friends, Fabian, was asking about something. And he told Fabian, he says, Fabian, do you really believe that God needs a sukuratati to check you out? So God knows everything. Why does he have sukuratati? This is the thing. I went to there was some great spiritual people in Romania that they were teaching everybody to hope, believe, trust. They didn't teach anybody to hate, fear, or judge. And that's what Paul's going to teach us in Galatians. The Old Testament law is not for us. Somebody's going to say, oh, but we have to, then none of the law is going to pass away until everything be fulfilled. That's what Christ said. He said, not one dot over the I and not one cross of the T in the law is going to pass away until everything is fulfilled. And then we saw him on the cross. What did he say? It is finished. Everything is fulfilled now. And the last prayer that the priest says inside during the liturgy, when we bring the holy gifts over to the side table, and he comes out and goes back in again for the last time, he goes over to the table and he reads a prayer. Thou who art thyself the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. All things have been fulfilled. The old law has passed away because all things have been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ did accomplish something in this life. And he liberated us from the law. Remember Apostle Paul says that we've been liberated from the law, we've been freed from the law. The handwriting of the law which was against us has been torn up. It really says the manuscript is torn up in it. Now we're under the promise that was given to Abraham. We're children of Abraham. Remember Christ said that God can raise up from the stones of the earth children for Abraham. He doesn't have to have, it's like when we find our Serbian people getting a little bit too arrogant, we say, look, God can turn stones into Serbs. And many times Serbs have turned themselves into stones. But we have to be really careful whether we're thinking about the gospel or whether we're thinking about the law of Moses. We have to choose sometime between the law and the gospel. Because there's a new law. And Jesus Christ gave us the new law himself. And Apostle Paul repeatedly tells us, the old law can't save you. See, the law cannot change your heart. It can try to make you behave properly, but it can't transform your heart. In order to enter the heavenly kingdom, our heart has to be changed. The inner person has to be transformed. And that's what grace can do, the grace of God. If we cooperate with that grace, it can do wonderful things inside of us. But we have to think about it. We have to pray about it. We have to strive to accomplish it. Just to think, it sounds so simple, to love your neighbor with all your being. To have empathy for your neighbor. To co-suffer with your neighbor. You see a suffering, you feel a suffering, you try to help them. That's the law of the new covenant. That's what I'm doing. But to love somebody is very difficult. We have to work at trying to love somebody. You know, sometimes you have to work at loving your wife or your husband. And you ask somebody, why do you love your husband? Can you answer? Can you give a real answer? Why do you love your wife? Can you give a real answer? Why do we put up with all this stuff from this other person who lives with us? Can you answer? You can't really give an answer. It's something in the heart that you can't define. It's something in the mind. It's something inside you that you can't even define. But even when the person is gone, even when they're dead, you still love them. And you can't say why. You can't define that. So love is very difficult. But love given without freedom is an obsession, it isn't love. And love demanded without freedom is a psychosis, but it's not love. So love has freedom and love has trust. And beyond that, it's hard to define it. It's hard to say what it is. So we have to strive until we feel in our hearts. When we can still judge and condemn another person, we don't have love yet. We didn't learn how to love yet. We don't understand another person. We don't know what's inside them. We don't know what kind of suffering they're enduring. We don't know what kind of pain they have. Why should we make their suffering worse or make their pain worse by passing judgment about them? Then we hurt the other person more. So let's pay attention to ourselves and try to straighten ourselves out. Try to find out what love really is. Try to strive to, our love should spread from this community where we do have love. And it should spread everybody around us some way. Because Christ said, if you have love one for another, if you have love among yourselves, people will know that you're my disciples. But if you don't have love one for another, if you have a community full of politics and full of gossip and full of slander and full of you have this party and that party and the other party, then people know that you're not the followers of Christ. So let's pay attention to Jesus Christ for a change and see what Christianity is really all about. Sometimes we think it's an ethnic way of being. Well, I'm Orthodox because I'm Serbian. I'm Orthodox because I'm Romanian. You know, the metropolitan of Oltenia in called the old one, what was it called? Huh? Craiova, yeah. Now it's Oltenia. He told me Oltenia is the most Orthodox part of Romania because we don't have any other religions in Oltenia. But we have the lowest church attendance of any place in Romania. So it didn't really good to be Orthodox, you still didn't do anything about it. So you have to think, what does it mean to be a Christian? Don't take it for granted. Don't say, oh, I'm a Christian. It's easier to say, I'm a Christian. Doesn't mean you really are. You know, you're a Christian when you love your neighbor. You're a Christian when you love God. You're a Christian when you want to help your neighbor instead of judging them. Then you're a Christian. But Christianity is something in the heart, not something in the brain. So that's what we're going to see in Galatians. Anybody got any questions? No?
Completely unrelated.
Hmm?
Not related to today, Galatian. I have a question for you regarding the ways a funeral should be, like for us Orthodox. Because we've been taught by our priest incineration wouldn't be a choice.
Yeah.
You have to go in down there.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure because I heard different.
Well,
Which
there's
one would be the
different
right
information.
way?
I'll tell you one thing about the funeral. Should be in the church. Romanians sometimes are superstitious. They don't want a dead person in the church.
It's true.
But it should be in the church. The coffin should be open. The priest should be standing by the head of the person in the coffin, because we don't serve for the person. We serve with the person.
Okay.
We're serving with the person who's alive unto God. And we're going to bury a sacred treasure in the ground. We're not just disposing of the remains. But, you know, in Romania and Moldova, you have to blow a trumpet in front of the coffin to keep demons from turning the person into a vampire. It's, you know, not even worth discussing.
I never did that, and I'm from Moldova.
Yeah, well, I blew the trumpet a couple of times in Moldova. So,
Yeah.
it really, it sounds awful. It doesn't have any music.
Not good.
But the thing is, we even treat funerals in the wrong way. The priest is supposed to wear white vestments
Okay.
because, I mean, in the tradition of the church, he wears white vestments because it's a Mika Pascha.
Oh, okay.
It's a Mika Pascha. Every funeral is a little Pascha. Every funeral proclaims the resurrection. So we should serve it with, like, stand by the coffin. Stand by the person who's in the coffin. We're serving with him or her. We're not just serving for them. The coffin, it's forbidden to have a closed coffin in an Orthodox funeral unless you have a good reason. Now, about whether you bury somebody or whether you cremate somebody, that's up to local authorities. In Moscow, they cremate because they're out of space. They don't have any place to bury people anymore. And some places in Siberia where you can't dig in the ground, they cremate person. So it's up to local thing.
Thank
And in the old country, I say in Serbia anyway, we make a huge tafos, huge burial place, and the whole family is in their own little shelf.
Oh, yeah.
In Greece and in southern Serbia, you can bury somebody only for 3 years, and you bring the bones up and put them in a little chapel, because there's not very much space to do it.
But when you don't have like we cremated Michael, you
Yeah.
allow that.
Well, I think it's local decision.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people will insist, no, you can't cremate. Yeah, but why? Because in Byzantium, they didn't want people to cremate because they were cutting all the trees off the forest. And really, you needed the trees to build ships with.
And we didn't have we didn't have the tafo.
No, yeah, you didn't have time.
We didn't have.
Well, you know, it's a problem because I searched some funerals in Vancouver, and I was astonished. It can cost you $50,000 to bury somebody in Vancouver.
You don't have
Funerals
that
like,
money.
I buried somebody not too long ago at Woodlawn. And when I was driving to the gravesite, I asked the driver, how much does it cost to bury somebody here? He says, the cheapest gravesite is $25,000.
Oh.
You know, and then you're going to charge you $10,000 for the coffin and the funeral services. It's going to be $35,000. It's cheaper. It's going to maybe cost you $50,000
Yeah.
when it's over. And nobody can afford that. You can't do it. So you have to adjust. It's called economia. You know, there's in the church there's economia. It's you know, you can get married 3 times in the church. Like if you can get a crowning once, if you get divorced, get remarried, we have a kind of a shorter service. And if you get married a 3rd time, it's kind of a cold service, but you get married 3 times. It's called economia. You're not supposed to allow divorce, but divorce happens. So the church thinks, first of all, in the Roman Catholic Church, they think, how do we punish the person? In the Orthodox Church, we think, how do we help them save their soul under their new circumstances? We think salvation, they think punishment. So it's called economia. You allow that, because divorce happens, it's a civil matter. Somebody shows up and says, we got a civil divorce, you're the papers, and now we want to get remarried. So I say, yeah, okay, it's better to marry than to burn. If a young person loses a spouse or gets divorced, they're not going to stay chaste. They're not going to stay without sex if they're young. So we get them married so we can channel it properly. See, we have to think about their salvation, not how to punish them. So sometimes you allow things that are not regular because there's a necessity. See, sometimes we have economia like that in the church. You have to use it very carefully. But we have economia, it's a circumstance that happens. So, yeah,
Thank you so
you have
much.
to take it up with the local bishop. So, anyway, anybody else? Okay, that's off.
It is truly meet to call thee blessed Theotokos, ever blessed and